introduction,
You're welcome. You can come right here.
That's great.
Okay, all right.
Here?
Yep, right here. Right there. Don't sit. You got to stand. You got to speak to everybody.
Yes.
They can't. They won't see you if you sit.
Really?
Say a word here.
Yeah, please. Also, well,
Okay.
Thank you for allowing us to have this presentation here. I'm speaking on behalf of the Hands of Syria Coalition that is organizing a tour in the United States for Eva. This, I think, is the third presentation we have since New York City, Washington, D.C., and this one in Newark is the third one. There's 4 or 5 more organized for New Haven, Boston, Detroit, Denver, and then California, 3 different cities in California. We are trying to bring up the awareness about the crimes that are being committed against the people of Syria, and we were very happy that we could get Eva to agree to come. She has been spending a lot of time in Syria, and especially in Aleppo, and she's coming with first-hand information for you. She just returned, actually, from Aleppo.
Wow.
Thanks very much. I'm a soft speaker, but I'll try to project. Thank you, Maman. Just a bit of background information. When things started in Syria, I didn't really know anything about the country, but I had this feeling that what I was hearing on Al Jazeera was not true, and as it turns out, I was right. Al Jazeera is funded by Qatar, which has a vested interest in the destruction of the Syrian state.
Wow.
Yeah, so I started just, doing my own research, reading independent sites that I trusted, there's a Canadian one called Global Research, which I also contribute to, and Russia Today and Sputnik and other sites. And eventually in April 2014, I had the chance to go for my first time to Syria, because I really think it's important to go and witness for yourself and talk with people. And I speak, basic colloquial Arabic, so I was able to interact with people and, hear from them and understand in general what they're saying, what they aspire for, what they believe or how they feel about how the media is portraying what's happening in Syria. Not just the media, but human rights groups and our Western leaders. I'm going to skip forward to, I've gone back to Syria 5 times since my first trip.
Wow.
And as Baman mentioned, I've been to Aleppo, now it's 4 times, July, August, and then twice in November. And there's, everywhere in Syria is important. And I'm going to try to touch on some of the main myths or the main important points about Syria. But I will start with Aleppo, because it's now, I'm sure you're aware, in the news. And depending on what source you look at, there's two essential versions of what's happening in Aleppo. So I'll start just in brief with the corporate media, lying NGOs, lying Western leadership, and Gulf leadership, or sheikdoms, versions of Aleppo. Their versions of Aleppo, and Syria in general, are that there are rebels trapped and besieged by an evil regime that is starving them and bombarding them, because that's what the regime really gets off on, killing people. This is their version. They don't account for, so Aleppo, I'll just give you a bit of context, if I may. This is obviously, Aleppo is not rectangular, but if you imagine Aleppo, there are pockets of eastern and southern and formerly northern areas of Aleppo that were occupied by what the West called rebels, and what every Syrian I've met calls accurately terrorists, of all factions, from Al-Qaeda, ISIS in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, and factions which you might have heard of, like the Free Syrian Army, which has always been dubbed by the West as moderates, as freedom fighters, and this really rings a chord with some people who support other liberation movements, but they are not freedom fighters. They have committed the same heinous crimes as ISIS and al-Nusra. There's others which I'll be mentioning. So anyway, they've, since about July 2012, they encroached on the city. They occupied areas of the east, of the north, southern pockets, the west. And they basically made life hell, not only for the people living in those areas, but also for the people living in greater Aleppo. Because, again, using the reference, the main highway, which would have come up from one of the other main cities, Homs, which is kind of in central western Syria, ran through various provinces up into Aleppo. Those areas were controlled by terrorists, so basically that highway has been off limits for years. The other main access point is a smaller road that goes up kind of to the east and then swoops around either north or south of Aleppo. That road has been many times cut off by different terrorist factions, including ISIS, including al-Nusra, including others, meaning that the people of Greater Aleppo, which were about 1.5 million to 1,700,000, depending on different estimates, it meant those people were cut off from food, from essential daily supplies that came from outside of Aleppo. So that's one thing. For years, these people have endured sieges that you will never hear about in corporate media because it doesn't serve the agenda, which is to vilify the government, to paint these terrorists as rebels, and to eventually call for no-fly zones, which entail basically the destruction of the country, as we've seen with Iraq, as we've seen with Libya more recently. So again, for years, people in Aleppo, I mean like 1.5 million people, not these so-called 300,000 that the media has claimed in eastern areas of Aleppo, have endured sieges. They've also endured, since the terrorists took over these pockets, they've been for want of electricity and water. The main reasons being the power plant is in areas controlled by ISIS or other terrorists, and the water pumping stations were in areas controlled by the terrorists. And I say were, and I'll get to the recent developments, because as of recently, these areas have been liberated by the Syrian Arab Army. So to compensate for the lack of water, the government and different volunteer or aid associations in Aleppo have dug over 300 wells. So people were dependent on well water, which wasn't always potable. So sometimes, or not sometimes, often people were drinking water that was contaminated because it was the only thing they could get. And as far as electricity, those who could afford it were buying generator electricity. So you can imagine most people couldn't afford it, couldn't run refrigerators, or more significantly, in the winter, couldn't heat food or heat themselves. And just as another aside, I lived in Gaza for 3 years, and I'm very well aware of what it's like to live without electricity, without running water. It's not comfortable, especially in the winter. They might not get the deep snow we get, but it's really cold and clammy, and it gets into your bones, and it can make people sick and cause death. Another aspect of Aleppo is that it was the industrial hub of Syria. And I'm sure you can appreciate what it would mean if the industrial hub is basically looted and thieved of the majority of its industries or destroyed by these rebels, by these freedom fighters, supported by the West, supported by the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and supported by Turkey. And these terrorists, basically, the majority of them came through the border with Syria, so the Turkish border with Syria, with the complete consent of the Prime Minister Erdogan. He totally supports and enables terrorists to come and go. A regular train or a ferry of terrorists coming and going into Syria. And he is complicit in the thieving of factories in Aleppo. So on my visit in November, my first visit in November, I met with the head of what's it called, the Chamber of Industry in Aleppo. And he said there were 70,000 industries, from small businesses to large factories. And of these, roughly 50% are still functioning, and of those functioning at 15%. And these are, again, from small businesses to large factories. He said about 7,000 factories remain. And he cited video and photo evidence of large, lorries taking this heavy machinery out along the highway and into Turkey.
Wow.
So it's clearly something that wasn't done in the night. It's clearly something that was done, again, with the complicity of Erdogan. So those are some of the main things. I hope I haven't left anything. Oh, no, I have. One of the other major things is that for years, the people in Greater Aleppo have suffered from a bombardment of standard bombings like Grad rockets, other missiles. I'm not a military expert, so I can't list them all off.
Right.
But basically, conventional military rockets and missiles, explosive bullets, which I had an experience with myself, and then smaller, locally manufactured bombs. They basically use cooking gas canisters, stuff them with explosives and metal shards and other things that can create more damage, and then fire them out of these massive tube cannons called Hell cannons. They have varying sizes. They also use water heaters, and they stuff those with the explosives, and those are called Hell 2. And those can actually take out entire levels of buildings. This is something you won't hear about in the corporate media. Actually, on the first November trip I went to Aleppo, I was with some journalists from large media like BBC, New York Times, LA Times, and then some other independent journalists. And I went with them because I wanted to see, are they going to report truthfully on what they're seeing in Aleppo? And the majority of them, I still have to follow up on this project, but the majority of them, when I was there, I could hear them saying, oh, look at the destruction in eastern Aleppo. We didn't go to eastern Aleppo or eastern areas of Aleppo, but they're aware from photos that it is ravaged. I mean, Syria is fighting a war against terrorism. 101 of 193 UN member states have sent terrorists to Syria to kill and slaughter and destroy. Yeah, it's insane. And these people are called rebels or freedom fighters. And these journalists, they know very well, but they choose, for whatever agenda, usually money or careers, they choose to ignore. So, for example, we went to one of the industrial districts, here's Aleppo, in the northwest called Leramun. And it's devastated because terrorists, including from the FSA, there's a brigade called 16th Brigades, they were embedded there for years. And from there, they were firing the variety of rockets and bombs that I mentioned onto the civilians of Aleppo. And the Syrian army was waging a war against them. This includes airstrikes, so the area is devastated. Now, one thing I just want to note about that is when we went there to Leramun, it was my second time to Leramun, but this time we actually, with this group, I was taken down about 3 levels underground. And the building on the top was really devastated from bombings. 3 levels below ground, where the FSA had set up a prison to hold Syrian soldiers, presumably, in welded, like very small, smaller than a phone booth cells, it was perfectly intact. So if you use your brain, you realize they're bunkering down below ground, and that's why the devastation is so immense to the buildings. The people have fled, the civilians have fled, the only people in those areas are terrorists, and the Syrian government has a right to fight terrorists who have illegally entered their country. But these journalists didn't report that. They just reported, look at the devastation. Well, in my July visit to Aleppo, I met with the Aleppo Medical Association. And so one of the myths about Aleppo is that there's no doctors, or there's the last doctor, the last pediatrician. If you peruse like the New York Times, BBC, Al Jazeera, you'll hear this all the time. Because this is a way of convincing people who maybe are too busy, don't fully understand the situation, of feeling like, oh my God, we must do something. They've just killed the last doctor. There's only 10 more doctors in Aleppo. We must do something. And usually that something is a no-fly zone, which will actually kill people. But when I went to the Aleppo Medical Association, they said we have 4,160 registered and active doctors because the media, the corporate media, is talking about these pockets occupied by terrorists in eastern Aleppo and some formerly northern Aleppo. They're not talking about greater Aleppo. And this is significant because these people are the ones that are saving civilians that are being injured, maimed, or killed, in that case not saving them, by the terrorist bombings. The other thing I noticed, when I met these doctors, one named Dr. Nabil Antaki, he made a very good point, and you can look him up on Facebook, Nabil Antaki. He's a very articulate, I can spell that if you want, Nabil Antaki, Antaki. He made a good point. He said, Eva, the destruction isn't as immense in our area, but one mortar can create a tiny hole this size, but inside kill 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people at once. And I experienced that, just as an aside, I didn't experience it directly, but I went to the site of a mortar hit in Old Damascus. The mortar was fired from an area east of Damascus, still occupied by terrorists, on July 24th. And it hit a restaurant. Old Damascus, if you can imagine, is like any kind of old Arab city, densely packed, lanes like this. It hit a restaurant in which there are a lot of young women, people having coffee, shisha, and killed 11 people, including an infant. And this is one mortar. And I went there the day after, and you could still smell the blood. You could see the impact of the mortar. So that's just one personal example. These things have been raining down on Aleppo for years. So again, the physical destruction might not appear as immense, but according to the head of forensics, in the last 5 years, 11,000 civilians, this is excluding military personnel, have been killed by these mortars and rockets and missiles, etc., in the last 5 years. So that's something you won't hear. So I talked a bit about last hospitals, last doctors. I want to get into some of the myths that corporate media have put forth about Aleppo. Aside from that, they maintain that the Russian Air Force is bombing. They maintain until now that the Russian Air Force is bombing and killing civilians in Aleppo. Russia hasn't had planes over Aleppo for the last 6 weeks. So the Syrian army is fighting terrorism, and I'm going to get to the news soon, but this is one myth that they continue to put forth, and it's patently false. Other patently false myths are the destruction of hospitals. Now, some hospitals and some schools will be destroyed or damaged. It's a fact that in these areas, terrorists use them as bases. And I say it's a fact because there's video footage recently emerged showing schools, showing hospitals that have weapons inside, that are weapons factories, that have chemicals inside used to make chemical weapons. But anyway, I'll give you one concrete example. Earlier this year, just overnight, not spontaneously, it was coordinated. Overnight, suddenly all the front pages or all the websites of corporate media where the headline news was hospital bombed, hospital bombed. One of the hospitals they claimed was bombed was the hospital called Quds Hospital. Now the Russians actually had satellite imagery. This is in, I think it was, I want to say April this year. The Russians had satellite imagery to show that the hospital was in the same state as it was in October 2015. And I actually remember an interesting exchange. You can look up a Russia Today journalist, very articulate woman, I forget her name, and she's grilling the State Department spokesperson, who finally just deflects and says, okay, it wasn't bombed. But it doesn't matter because the damage is done in people's minds who get the soundbite in corporate media. Now, interestingly, so all the media claimed that this hospital was bombed. They also they didn't mention that coordinates were not given to the Syrians or Russians where the hospital was. So they were claiming the hospital was targeted. But if the coordinates were not given, then this is a discrepancy. In September, The Guardian, major British paper, claimed that this, the destroyed Quds Hospital was treating victims of chemical weapons attacks. So it's interesting that a city, an area under siege, somehow regenerated a hospital that was completely bombed and destroyed according to the earlier reports, and now is treating chemical weapons victims. In fact, this is the next myth, chemical weapons, and it doesn't apply exclusively to Aleppo, but all of Syria. Because in terms of this war on Syria that is premeditated, and this is also documented, from the 1990s, or at least we can say 2000s, the West has wanted to topple the government of Bashar al-Assad. And it is an elected government, and even the UN has recognized this. So there are many myths, and the way to do it, you have to vilify this elected government in order to topple them, as they've done with Saddam Hussein, as they've done with Gaddafi.
Yes.
So, they call him a baby killer, they call him a monster, they call him, a genocider. They say he's bombing hospitals. He's doing all this himself, by the way. He's very busy. It's insane, what they expect people to believe. But they also accused the Syrian army of using chemical weapons. And so one of the major ones, Obama made this statement about a red line, and I think it was a year to the day of that statement, in, I believe, August 2013, there was an incident in an area east of Damascus, the capital, called Ghouta, in which they claimed that the Syrian army had used chemical weapons and killed masses of people. BBC, to support this claim, extracted a photo from an Italian journalist. It was a photo of corpses in Iraq and said this was Ghouta under Assad's chemical weapons. They were called out on it, but again, the damage was done. The average person didn't know that they had completely fabricated this. And on that note, and on this specific incident of this chemical weapons attack that was not done by the Syrian army, and the UN spokeswoman who was there investigating, Carla Del Ponte, said it was the rebels that had sarin gas that committed the attacks. I can recommend a man named Robert Stewart in the UK. He's done extensive research into the manipulation of videos and photos that the West and these propagandists use to support their claims. The manipulation was so great, it went to the extent where they were taking children who had been kidnapped previously by these terrorists from western Syria, and they were using them in Ghouta, and they were using them in place A and then in place B, the same kid in two different places. So, I mean, this is not the first instance or the last of using children to manipulate the facts. There have been other allegations of chemical weapons use in Syria, but that was one of the most major ones because with that was supposed to come the red line and the big no-fly zone, and it didn't happen, thank God. Recently, they've been accusing, well, not recently, continuously they've been accusing Syria of chemical weapons usage. When I was there in November, my second November visit, I went to the second of the main hospitals in Aleppo. It's called the University Hospital. And I saw victims of what they believed was chlorine. I saw both military and civilians being administered oxygen because they were suffering from a chlorine attack. So chemical weapons attacks do occur, but it's by the terrorists. And as I mentioned, this school that had the chemical weapons, big 10-liter jars of toxic gases used to create chemical weapons were found recently in areas of Aleppo that have been liberated. I just want to get back quickly to the issue of hospitals. So I mentioned that they've said hospitals have been destroyed by the Syrian government or by the Russians. They don't mention the Kindi Hospital, which is a massive cancer treatment hospital, the biggest and the best in the Middle East, that was destroyed in December 2013 by, I believe it was al-Nusra, by terrorist truck bombings. They don't mention this, and this was a massive destruction of Syria's infrastructure. Syria is already suffering under criminal Western sanctions, and now these terrorists and the U.S.-led coalition are attacking Syria's infrastructure. For example, more recently, in the eastern Syria, in an area called Deir ez-Zor, they have repeatedly targeted bridges in this area. And they've taken out something like, I think it's 7 or 8 bridges. So bridges are important. Again, just to refer to my time in Gaza, during the 2012 Israeli war on Gaza, they targeted 2 of the main bridges. Gaza is a very small place. When they targeted the 2 bridges, there was only one way, or going through this valley that was basically a valley that sewage went through, the only way to get to Gaza City, to the hospitals, to the universities. So in cases of emergency, the lack of bridge is actually critical. Tim Anderson, who's a friend and colleague and an amazing, I really recommend you look him up. Tim Anderson in Australia. He's done a lot of excellent writing and research, and he's got a book out called The Dirty War on Syria. You can find it on Global Research. Anyway, in one of his articles about the attack on hospitals, he mentioned that 2/3 of Syria's national hospitals have been attacked and damaged by these terrorists. So that's 41 out of 94. When I was in Aleppo, the director of Razi Hospital said 20 of 40 of their hospitals are functioning. So this is both state hospitals and private hospitals. When I went to Aleppo in July, I went to the Dabit Maternity Hospital, which was internally destroyed when terrorists fired a rocket that landed right outside on a car, which exploded, and exploded 2 neighboring cars. The hospital was gutted, destroyed, and 3 women were killed. This never made the news. So I'll just briefly touch on a few other myths in Aleppo and in Syria in general. Starvation. For months, the corporate media of the United Nations, which is complicit in all these lies, have been saying the Syrian quote-unquote regime, otherwise known as the Syrian government, has been starving people, and they put the number of people in areas of eastern Aleppo. They call it eastern Aleppo. Syrians reject this division. They say we're all Aleppo. We're not divided. But the UN and the Western leaders have said from 270,000 to 300,000 people trapped and starving. It's true there was a siege on Aleppo, on these eastern areas occupied by terrorists, but this is a standard military tactic. And the government has done everything in its power to enable civilians to leave these areas. They established humanitarian corridors. They ensured that people, and even Syrian militants that want to lay down their weapons and take amnesty, can leave these areas. But the terrorists within, primarily al-Nusra, but also Nuruddin al-Zinki or others, Ahrar al-Sham, prevent people. They're using them as hostages. They prevent them from leaving to the extent that they fire upon them. In November, I met a family of IDPs, internally displaced people from one of the eastern areas who managed to escape. And according to them, they took the opportunity when there was fighting between the Syrian army and the terrorists within. They took that opportunity to escape via one of these humanitarian crossings. And their story coincides with recent reports we're hearing. If you're following Syrian reporters, people on Facebook that are announcing this news, Russia Today, Sputnik, or the Syrian news agencies, Recently, now, the last time I checked, it was, according to the Syrian ambassador to the UN, Dr. Al-Jafri, 100,000 people have been rescued or liberated from these areas, from the clutches of terrorists. And you'll see interviews of these people saying they were starving us. They had the meat. We had no meat. We could buy rice. We could buy bulgur. They were charging, let's see, for 1 kilogram, they were charging about from 10,000 Syrian pounds to 13,000 Syrian pounds. So in terms of dollars, let's see, when I was there, 500 Syrian pounds was $1. So let's do the math. 10,000 Syrian pounds is how much? 20 bucks for a kilo of rice.
It's 2 pounds. You should convert a kilogram to pounds too.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm a Canuck. Dang. Anyway, so I mean, this is serious. This issue of starvation, it does exist, but it's not due to the Syrian army or the Syrian government. The Syrian government has enabled Red Cross, UN, Syrian Red Crescent, in any case possible to go into these areas occupied by terrorists, eastern Aleppo areas, other areas in Syria. And when they're able to get in, what inevitably happens is the terrorist factions within take the supplies, medical supplies, food supplies, they hoard them, and if they sell them at these extortionist rates, and people can't afford it. So this myth of starvations, which not only the United Nations, not only Western media, corporate media, Western leaders jumped all over, but supposedly alternative independent media like Democracy Now! Or supposedly anti-war groups like Code Pink jumped all over this, and they endorsed. They can do their research, and I firmly believe they know that they're lying. I believe that they've sold out, they're receiving money, whatever the reason. But for example, there's a place called Madaya. In January of this year, all the media in chorus were saying the Syrian regime is starving the people of Madaya. When journalists got there, it was the same story. The people inside said, the terrorists took our food, the terrorists are starving us, we want out of here. And they were praising the Syrian army, those who were able to get out. These are the same things you'll hear if you're looking at people who escaped from eastern areas of Aleppo. They're saying, thank you to the Syrian army. I know I sound like a propagandist, but I swear to God, this is what people are saying. Thank you for rescuing us. So with Madaya, again, the Red Cross spokesperson in October 2015 said the Syrian government had facilitated enough food aid to go into Madaya, this district, to last for many months. But come January, all the media was reporting starvation. So again, it's not due to the Syrian government, it's due to the people within who have hoarded the food. And this is according to the testimonies of people in Madaya. So this starvation, attacking hospitals, killing civilians, these are all methods of demonizing the Syrian government. And in fact, in every case, it's the terrorists that the West calls moderate rebels that are doing these acts. I mentioned the sanctions, and I think I just want to touch on the fact that, I'll just speak on some of the recent news. I said that about 100,000, this was a few days ago, December 5th, Dr. Al-Jafri, the UN representative, Syrian representative of the UN, said 100,000 civilians had been liberated. Now, as of the news I saw this morning, 95% of these areas that were occupied since mid-2012 by these terrorist factions have been liberated. This is really significant because every time in the past years, every time the Syrian army made advances to liberate, some sort of ruse was played by Western leaders. Another meeting at Geneva, another ceasefire that nobody adhered to except the Syrians and later the Russians. And I can give examples. The last ceasefire that was called was in September, and immediately 20 of the main terrorist rebel groups said, we're not participating. And from the very beginning, they violated the ceasefire. And according to Russian sources, throughout the ceasefire and by the end, they had violated it, not just in Aleppo, but all over Syria 300 times, killing over, it was 150, I think, Syrian soldiers and 63 civilians. But it wasn't just the terrorists that the West backs and arms and finances that did this. It was the U.S.-led coalition in Syria that also violated the ceasefire. And I just want to make 2 points here. Number one, our media says Russia is killing people, that Russia is illegally in Syria. Russia was invited by the Syrian government. It is legally in Syria. The U.S., Canada, and everybody else participating in this coalition are illegally in Syria. They're illegally bombing in Syria. They're not fighting ISIS in Syria. This is their main myth. We're fighting ISIS. We're fighting terrorists. they have accidentally dropped supplies to ISIS. They missed the chance. Look, okay, we'll use this. This is Syria. Where's Palmyra? Oh, offhand, I'll just say in the middle. It's not, but the U.S.-led coalition missed the chance to to destroy a convoy of ISIS SUVs, trucks coming from Iraq into Syria to Palmyra, one of the most ancient, sites in Syria. This was in 2015. They somehow, with all their sophisticated technology and satellite imagery, they missed the opportunity to catch these monsters, these terrorists, coming through open desert, which enabled ISIS, and it wasn't just one axis, they came from various points. They didn't stop ISIS. They enabled ISIS to take over Palmyra, to murder over 100 Syrian soldiers and many more civilians. And they murdered them in the most gruesome ways. Hanging, point-blank assassination, putting them in cages, lighting them afire. More recently, I mentioned the U.S. participated in the violation of the ceasefire. On September 17th, the U.S.-led coalition basically for nearly 1 hour attacked Syrian army positions in eastern Aleppo in Deir ez-Zor region, killing at least 83 Syrian soldiers. It might be over 100. I've seen conflicting reports, but at least 83. This was a prolonged attack. It wasn't a one-off. Nearly 1 hour. Multiple strikes. And the day before, they'd been surveilling. They knew, and prior to this, they knew this was a Syrian army post. Yet they attacked it immediately after ISIS took over the post. And to this day, exceptional America will not apologize, will not accept guilt, will not admit that they intentionally murdered these soldiers. And on the note of the Syrian army, these are from the people. The way our media portrays it, it's Assad's army. The army existed before Assad. They portray it as Alawi army. The army is plural, and it's made up of many Sunnis, if not the majority of Sunnis. Whenever I've been in Syria, everybody I've met has served in the army or has a loved one serving in the army, and they're fiercely proud because these people are defending Syria. So this is something you won't hear in the media. And when you hear of people coming from liberated areas, when I say they're praising the army, it's because, again, the army is from them, and the army is fighting this disease of terrorism that nobody else will fight except the allies of Syria. There's many other myths, but I'd like to just talk about some of the sources that people cite in corporate media. Well, often the sources have no names. They're just unnamed activists. And anybody who's done some writing, you can get away with that once in a while. People have genuine security issues. They don't want their names to be known for fear of reprisal, for example. But all the time, it becomes not credible. The other source that is always cited is a group called the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Any guesses how many people are in this group?
One.
One man, Rami Abdurrahman. Is he in Syria? No. He's in the UK. And he's the main source for UN reports, for corporate media reports. He's anti-government, and he himself relies on unnamed activists, on terrorists themselves, and on another group called the White Helmets. Anybody hear of the White Helmets?
Yeah, I was going to ask about what's your take on that.
Okay. So anybody else hear of the White Helmets?
Yeah.
Okay, that's more people than in Aleppo have heard about the White Helmets. The White Helmets purport to be a rescue group from the people, of the people, working to save the people from regime and Russian airstrikes. They operate primarily in terrorist or revolutionary controlled areas of Syria, so eastern areas of Aleppo, Idlib, which is western Syria, and they have slick propaganda. And the reason they're so able to produce such slick propaganda is they've received about $100 million from the US, the UK, EU, and then other states. Again, they purport to be, rising up from the people to defend. These are people who are exceptionally well funded, who may not, in fact, be operating in Aleppo, because I made that point. Who in Aleppo has heard of the White Helmets? When I was there, nobody had heard of them. Okay, so it's Greater Aleppo. They're not operating there. But people in Greater Aleppo have relatives in eastern areas of Aleppo. They talk to them. Those people have never heard of the White Helmets. More recently, now, 95% of these areas have been liberated. Where are the White Helmets? Nobody's seen them. So these are a very slick propaganda tool that uses babies, carries them like a sack of potatoes, according to one of my rescuer friends. And in fact, let's just touch on one of these myths that the White Helmets were involved with. A boy named Omran. He was like a, I think, 6-year-old kid, around that age, purportedly injured by either evil Syrian airstrikes or evil Russian airstrikes, one of the two.
He was on TV?
He was on TV. He was on every front page.
That was the ambulance kid. That
full haircut, adorable. And so he had this little trickle of what looks like blood, and he was plopped down on an orange ambulance seat, just staring. As photographers took their photo. One of the photographers was a guy named Mahmoud Raslan. One of the photographers had also affiliations with this terrorist group called Nuruddin al-Zinki. Nuruddin al-Zinki, several months ago, beheaded a 12-year-old or 13-year-old Palestinian boy. And if you have the stomach for it, it's a gruesome video. You can watch the entire beheading by this moderate rebel. And the West wrote that as a one-off. They wrote it off as a one-off. Oh, well, mistakes happen, just like the FSA leader who mistakenly ate the organ of a Syrian soldier. They're still moderate. But anyway, this photographer who photographed Amran, one of the main ones, he is affiliated with this Nuruddin al-Zinki group. Back to Amran, I've spoken with rescuers, and they all say, if there's a kid or a person who has been injured, you don't just sit them down and take photos of them. You give them first aid. The kid is going to be in shock, so he needs oxygen. He needs to be touched. He needs to get out of his shock, or he's going to die. So Amran, he's actually appeared in other photos, and there's other children, a girl who's sometimes named Aya, who's appeared carried by the white helmets in other photos in different areas, in different timelines. So again, I was mentioning children being used as a weapon of propaganda. White helmets, they claim to be neutral. Many of them, people, including a dear friend of mine, Vanessa Bealey, I highly encourage you to look up her work. She writes a lot for 21st Century Wire. She's been for a year and a half steadily digging into who's the white helmets. And she found out they were formed, again with this money, which now amounts to about 100 million, maybe more, by a former British, I want to say mercenary, military person, James Lemercier. And they have ties to Turkey, they have ties to the West. And again, many of these creatures are sometimes posed in pristine white helmets with no blood, no dust, nothing, as rescuers always are. And in other cases are holding weapons and posing with the terrorists. They've even been found right at the scene of assassinations. So you see somebody being point blank assassinated and the white helmets are right there to pick up the body. And they've been seen standing on the bodies of Syrian soldiers because that's how neutral they are. So they're clearly a tool used for propaganda, and they're very effective. In fact, the West was nominating them for a Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize. And Democracy Now! Has participated in this validation of these creatures called the White Helmets. If you're interested to know more about them, because there's a lot of information, there's a 5-minute video based a lot on Vanessa's research. It's called White Helmets, Al-Qaeda with a Facelift. Very informative video. It gives you the basics very concisely. But they've been effective, and until now, people are still doing GoFundMe campaigns and Avaz campaigns to raise money for these people that are already funded over $100 million. On the other hand, their second name is the Syrian Civil Defense, but they are not the Syrian Civil Defense. There is a Syrian Civil Defense, and they are volunteers. And if you contrast them to the white helmets, I mentioned pristine white uniforms. In Gaza, I'm going to keep referring to Gaza, but I rode with medics in Gaza during the 2008-2009 Israeli massacre of Palestinians. I was riding in ambulances with Palestinian medics. And even if you just use your brain, obviously if you're a medic working in war times, your clothes are going to be soiled with blood and dust and rubble, etc. White helmets' clothes never are. The real Syrian civil defense, they don't even have the equipment, let alone the clothing, the helmets that these frauds do. And one of the reasons they don't have enough ambulances and equipment is because much of their equipment has been stolen by terrorists. The other main reason is the sanctions, the Western sanctions on Syria, which are criminal and illegal. And if you refer to Iraq, and it was like 500,000 children who died as a result of the sanctions, it should be very fresh in people's minds, and yet Western leaders still put this this idea forth that, oh no, the sanctions are just to topple, to put pressure on this regime. They're not. They're in the end, the bottom line is the Western leaders and the media prostitutes that march along with them, they don't care about human lives in Syria. They don't care about democracy or human rights. When you look at these terrorist factions, whether they're FSA, whether they're Nusra, whether they're Nuruddin Azinki Ahrar al-Sham, they're all committing these acts of terrorism, and many of them are marching to this warped perception of Islam that comes from the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, which itself is warped, or from Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, which is it's so warped, you can't even, I mean, I'm sure you're aware of the lack of human rights on every scale in Saudi Arabia. It's hideous, and yet Saudi Arabia is the head of the Human Rights Council of the UN and has a say on democracy in Syria. The people in Syria in 2014 voted for their president, and I should know the statistic, it was 78 or 77% voted for President Assad. The UN even recognizes. Yeah?
Let her finish, Brad.
I'll wrap it up real quick. I was in Lebanon in between visits to Syria when the votes in Lebanon occurred, and the people that I saw, Syrians I saw, flooded the main highway walking, because the Syrian embassy in Lebanon is not in the heart of Beirut. It's actually out of Beirut, so several kilometers out, many more than several, but we took buses to get to a point where the roads were too clogged with people trying to get to the embassy, that for several kilometers in the heat and the blazing sun we walked to stand under the sun for hours just for the chance to cast their vote. And people were